It's a really great pleasure for me tonight to introduce our guest speaker. As soon as he starts talking, you'll know that he was born in Scotland. Educated at the University of Glasgow, which I had the opportunity to visit for the first time in September. He graduated mechanical engineering in 1955 and joined Orenda Engines, working on the Iroquois for the Aero. Became a faculty member at the University of Concorde and with Rolls Royce, Herb, on the RB211.
Well, Bristol Siddeley first all on the Olympus 593,
okay.
And then Rolls Royce on the RB211.
He got his PhD in 1968 and joined Carleton University in 1970 before retiring in 1998. Having spent 10 years as chairman of mechanical and aerospace engineering and is still active teaching aerospace propulsion at both Carleton and Cranfield. He's also past president of the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute and a recipient of the MacCurdy Award in 2004. So could you please help me welcome her, Saravanamuttoo.
Thank you very much, Don. Can you all hear me at the back? I'm normally used to speaking without a mic, but I've mic'd up and I hope it don't get too loud. The talk tonight was some time back. It dawned on me that I might be one of the very few people who'd actually flown on the Constellation, the Comet, and the Concorde over quite a long period. So I put together this lecture a couple of years ago at Cranfield, and I've been asked to do it quite a number of times since then. I've only been in Canada 62 years. That is how I lost my accent. Now, if you go back to looking at Atlantic crossings, it used to be that crossing the Atlantic was a big deal. And of course, the first people to do it were Alcock and Brown, who flew from Newfoundland to Ireland, which was actually just over 2,000 miles. Lindbergh came quite a bit later, and he actually flew much further and saw New York to Paris. It always irritates me the number of Americans who think Lindbergh was the first to cross the Atlantic, because that was very much not true. Now, Newfoundland was very important in the early part of transatlantic crossings because it was geographically the nearest point to Europe. I think it's Cape Spear that is the nearest point to Europe. So all of these early flights started in Newfoundland, and of course they all went west to east. There were a few people who tried to go from east to west and didn't know anything but headwinds, and quite a lot of people lost their life doing that. Now, if you go back to the beginnings of what was going to become commercial transport across the Atlantic, we had the idea was of using flying boats. Actually, before I go into that in 1934, the Qantas started the Kangaroo route, flying from Britain to Australia. And would anybody like to hazard a guess how many stops they made?
7.
Any advance on 7?
12.
Any advance on 12?
20.
Any advance on 20? Well, the answer was 42 stops. 42 stops in 12 days. So that we're doing a bit better than that. We've just recently done the first non-stop flight from Perth to London. But with the flying boats, the initial thought was that flying boats were the answer because there was lots of water about. You didn't need to make big runways and so on and so forth. And in fact, my uncle was a maintenance engineer on the C-class flying boats with Imperial Airways, not BOAC, not British Airways, Imperial Airways. But Pan Am were going to fly with the Boeing 314, and they have New York, Bermuda, Azores, Marseille, and I think there was also Bordeaux to Southampton. So that was about 5 or 6 stops. And of course, Southampton was not London, you had to get the train up from there. It was interesting that Botwood in Newfoundland was going to be the centre of aerospace transportation in Canada. A number of years ago on holiday, I made a visit to Botwood, and there certainly wasn't very much left to see there. But the routing that Imperial Airways were going to do was New York, Montreal, Botwood, Foynes, was in Ireland, and Southampton. And it's interesting, in fact, that that going from North America to Europe, they could do it most of the time, but coming back, it really was very dependent on the winds. And in fact, they made one flight from Foynes to Botwood, which took 18 hours.
Oh.
Now we're back to 18 hours again, but now that gets you from Singapore to New York. Now, if you look at the great circle distances, the great circle distance, of course, being the shortest distance around the circumference of the Earth between 2 points. If you look at the distance from London to Gander, and then the distance from Gander to New York, 3,466 statute miles. And if you look at London to New York on the Great Circle route, it's 3,466 statute miles, exactly the same. So Gander is right on the Great Circle route. And you can see the Great Circle route there, and we now regularly fly over Gander, or very close to Gander, going to Europe. Now Gander, in fact, became very important during World War II because it enabled the ferry people to transport aircraft at Lockheed Hudson's from Gander to Prestwick, and the airport at Gander was built simply for that purpose. In fact, I think Gander actually really only exists because of that, and then it flew into to Prestwick, where I happened to be born. Now, the thing that was interesting was that there were really limitations on the range, and particularly if you're trying to fly westbound. Eastbound very often required 1 stop, but westbound could require 2 stops. And of course, nobody today would think of flying the Atlantic and making a stop. Now, I said the Gander, the airport was built in World War II, allowing ferry flights to the UK, and the principal stopping point westbound. The KLM flying Amsterdam to New York made 2 stops, Amsterdam, Shannon, Gander, New York. And this seems incredibly slow in what we're used to today. Now, the effect of headwinds would be nice to have a bit more light, but the bottom curve there shows the time with a speed of about 300 miles an hour, which would be typical of a Constellation, 325 miles an hour perhaps, 3,500 miles, about 11 hours. But if you had a 50 mile an hour wind, it increased the flight time by about a couple of hours. So that the wind had as a particularly big effect on these what were then long-range flights. 3,500 miles today is nothing. Now you see the effect of the headwinds. The Constellation normally made 2 stops. The Comet westbound would have to stop in Gander, Iceland. The Comet basically didn't have transatlantic range. Concorde, the effect of the wind was virtually nil. And of course, in the current today, the only effect of winds is it may take you a little bit longer to get there. But nobody ever hears now of anybody stopping, having to refuel because of winds on the Atlantic. Okay, now the Lockheed Constellation was essentially the pinnacle of the piston-engined aircraft. And there's a rather interesting fact about going back to aircraft like the Constellation. One thing that's interesting is when we look at today's aircraft, the fuselage is essentially a long tube. But if you look at if you look at the fuselage of the Constellation, you can see that all these sections here are different diameter. And that was basically done for the aerodynamics of the aircraft. And of course today we have just long tubes. The Constellation, again you see the square windows there. Nobody thought much about pressurization or windows blowing out. It doesn't look as though very much of that's actually used for passengers. There were these wing tanks here carried about 400, 500 gallons of fuel, and the Constellation was in fact the best of the piston aircraft.
They used to say it was the best three-engined airplane on the Atlantic.
Oh yes.
Because the engines weren't all that reliable.
You're not kidding. And if you actually, I did a bit of looking through this, and I found there were quite a lot of them which actually had 3 engines stopped. Not 1 engine stopped and 3 running, but 3 engines stopped and 1 running. And there were quite a lot lost from that point of view. Now, the other interesting thing about the Constellation was that there were several versions built. The principal one was the 1049. I'll talk about that a little later, the numbers. And then finally, the 1649, which was the ultimate piston engine aircraft, which was capable of flying from Europe to Los Angeles, not non-stop. I crossed the Atlantic just once with Tom crossing on the Constellation, and on the way back, it was flying Tiger was the aeroplane, and when we were in Glasgow, found all these people stranded in Glasgow over what's happening, and it turned out that Flying Tiger had no aeroplanes, and we were all stranded in Glasgow for a few days, and I had a window seat on this aeroplane. But coming back, it happened to be an L1049H, which was the freight version with no windows, so you could actually sit and watch a vibrating wall for about 14 hours, which was extremely dull. And of course, there was no in-flight entertainment of any sort on that. Now, some interesting things about the Constellation that I've trouble getting accurate numbers in some of these. So some of these numbers are kind of doubtful, but on the whole, they're pretty good. But maximum takeoff weight of the Constellation, 120,000 pounds. That number of 92 passengers sounds optimistic, but it was the best number I could find. But I would guess that the number was really closer to 70. Now, one of the interesting things was that the flight crew on aircraft like the Constellation, the Strata Cruiser, and that was 5. And that was 5, not including stewardesses and whatnot. That was 5 on the flight deck. 2 pilots, a navigator, an flight engineer, and a radio officer. So that was quite a big chunk. Cruise speed, approximately 325 miles per hour. And the best estimate I could make of the fuel burn per passenger on Constellation was 520 pounds per passenger from London to New York. We'll look at some of these numbers a bit later. Now, the Constellation had the Wright R3350 turbo compound engine, and with the radial engines in the United States, the number there was actually the capacity in cubic inches. So it was boiled down to about 1 horsepower per cubic inch and 1 horsepower per pound. The rather startling number, though, is if you look at the fuel consumption, the cruise SFC, very good, in fact, but the lube oil was a similar sort of, about 5%, at least of that, and the lube oil capacity on the Lockheed Constellation was 224 gallons, which was burned, most of it, anyway. I dug up some other information that on the Argus, which we flew, and there's one in the museum somewhere here, not fully done up yet, but the Argus burned about 600 gallons of lubricating oil on a long patrol. And the B-36, the very big nuclear bomber that the Strategic Command operated, it carried no less than 1,200 gallons of lubricating oil. So that oil changes were quite a big deal. I'll back up. That same engine, the Stratocruiser, which was the other possibility, used the Pratt & Whitney 28-cylinder engine, and the less said about it, the better. The chief engineer of Pan Am said that the in-flight shutdown rate was intolerable. It wasn't even worth quoting a number. It was so complicated and such a lot of trouble. Now, there was a big noise problem with the Constellation, and one of the interesting noise problems was because of its very low rate of climb, the noise was spread over a long distance. And there was in fact no technical or operational solution to this. Now, I lived in Downsview when I was working at Orenda, and when the Constellation flew over my apartment, you could not hear the telephone ring. When the Comet came in the early 60s, when the Comet flew over, you could barely hear it because it was so high up. So that if there had been a large number of Constellations and Stratocruisers and that sort of stuff around, the noise problem would have been absolutely awful. Now, the first jet crossing was Canberra from the Royal Air Force that flew from Ireland to Gander, and it actually did a return crossing in one day, which was pretty impressive in 1951. That was the year I started university. When I was a student, there was a big argument going on which was better, turboprop or turbojet. The answer in the long run was the best answer was the turbofan. But the British put a lot of money into turboprops. The Viscount was actually very successful. And Air Canada were one of the biggest users of the Viscount, and they operated Viscounts for many years. But Bristol built the Britannia, which was a long-range transport aircraft, and unfortunately, the problems with the engines with icing troubles, which were found very late in the program, and it was essentially because of the peculiar flow path through the Proteus engine, and there's some undercarriage problems, so it really didn't get into service as quickly as it should. And by the time it got into service, it didn't have enough time to really establish its superiority over the existing piston engines. But the Britannia was a very quiet aeroplane, and it was interesting in Canada because in Canada, in 1959, just after the Arrow crash, I went to work for a small company in Toronto, and being a single guy, I get sent off on all these built-run jobs in the middle of the night. And in those days, Air Canada were just starting to bring in so-called tourist fares. But to get a tourist fare on Air Canada, that meant catching a North Star or a Constellation out of Toronto at 2 o'clock in the morning, arriving at Montreal at 4 o'clock in the morning, or some equally bad timing coming back. Canadian Pacific bought the Britannia, and they brought the Britannias into service, transcontinental. The more important thing was they carried about 20 first-class passengers and about 100 economy passengers. So this was the first real introduction of more economic flying in Canada. Now the Britannia, you see, is quite a bit heavier than the Constellation, 120 passengers, cruise speed 375 miles an hour, quite a long range. And in fact, El Al used to fly Britannias non-stop from New York to Tel Aviv. But notice that now we've gone to turbines, the oil capacity has come down from 224 gallons to 36 gallons, which is quite a change. Now, in fact, I have a friend who flies 777s for Air Canada. He told me that on the GE90, the oil capacity is 29 pints, and they actually load 24 pints a day. So it's incredible how much less oil that we use for lubrication today. Now, the Comet 1 was a false start. But the interesting thing, when I started looking into this, digging back a few things, I found that the Comet 1 was in fact almost exactly the same size as the 737-100, which sold nearly 20 aeroplanes. And the Comet only carried 36 passengers, and its range was about 1,500 miles. But it had a cruise speed of close to 500 miles an hour. Now, the Comet was in fact competing against things like the North Star, which British Airways operated, called it the Argonaut. And of course, it only had this short range. But the remarkable thing is, British BOAC operated the Comets to Tokyo. And this was a mere 9 stops. So here's the Johannesburg, London to Johannesburg, 5 stops. London to Tokyo, 9 stops. But it was about twice as fast as the Argonaut. And you know, it's ridiculous now when we start talking about maybe 9 stops going to Tokyo, where like London to Tokyo is not a particularly long flight by today's standards. Now, the Comet 4 was in fact more successful. The Comet 4 came along after they'd sorted out the problems with fuselage fatigue. And it's interesting because I was a young student at that time, and I talked to all sorts of senior people in the industry, in the Air Force, whatever, about what they thought was the Comet, the reasons for the Comet crashes. Absolutely nobody had the faintest idea or even suggested fatigue. Nobody thought in those days that if you blew up a fuselage, slowly pressurized it, and then depressurized it, that had any problem at all. And of course that's low cycle fatigue, but that was certainly not understood at all in the 50s. Now the Comet got down to flight crew of 4, quite a small aeroplane really, range about 2,700 miles, not a true transatlantic aeroplane. One of the interesting things about the Comet, which was also true of the 707 and the DC-8, was it didn't have an auxiliary power unit. And the reason these aircraft didn't have an auxiliary power unit was because they were always operating from major airports like London, Toronto, and New York, Paris, and so on, where there was full ground support. So there was no APU on the Comet. So that meant there was no air conditioning on the aeroplane. Well, once you got away from the gate, no air conditioning until the engine was started. Now, I flew from New York to London on a hot, muggy day in August 1960, and we were actually towed to the end of the active runway, and we waited there in the queue till we finally got permission to start the engines. And this was an hour in the aeroplane in steaming tropical heat with no air conditioning, and it was mighty uncomfortable. But as I say, that these early aircraft did not have APUs. The first commercial aircraft to have an APU was in fact the 727. Now the 707, the original 707-120, wasn't a true non-stop Atlantic aeroplane. It wasn't designed as such. It was a transcontinental aeroplane. But it also had a big noise problem because the early straight jet engines were very noisy. And the eastbound, the way that Pan Am operated the 707, and this appeared in their printed timetable, and some of you will remember airline timetables that were printed and regularly available, and it showed New York to London as non-stop with an asterisk. And you looked at the asterisk and it said, 2 technical stops. And the fact was that because of noise hysteria in New York, they would put just enough fuel in to get to Boston because they could then take off and make less noise. So they flew non-stop all the way from New York to Boston, and they put as much fuel into the aeroplane as they could get, and they managed to get non-stop all the way to Iceland, and then they refueled in Iceland, and they had enough route to get to London or Paris. And it was actually significantly faster to fly in the Britannia, which I did it non-stop, than do these 2 stops. And with the basic JD3 engine, the straight jet engine, noise was a major problem. With the fan version of the JT3, the JT3D, this became the first true non-stop aeroplane on the Atlantic. And it was still plenty noisy, but it was really a very good aeroplane. Now Vickers, that later became BAC, they had some interesting design solutions, if that's the right word. But they built the VC-10, which was the British response to the 707. And they put the engines at the back. And actually the main reason for putting the engines at the back was to be different. I mean, it was not a case of saying, okay, we'll build something like the Boeing 707, so what? But anyway, the thing was the VC-10 was very popular with passengers because it was very quiet inside. Now this was very interesting because Vickers built 2 aeroplanes, the Vanguard. Now you remember the Vanguard, Air Canada was one of the only 2 airlines, Air Canada and British Airways, to buy the Vanguard. And the Vanguard was very quiet outside and terribly noisy inside. Maybe some of you people remember flying in the Vanguard. So in the Vanguard, that British BAC or Vickers managed to confine all the noise in the passenger compartment, whereas in the VC-10, it was very quiet inside and hideously noisy outside. And some of you remember the VC-10s used to come through Ottawa regularly in a kind of triangular shuttle between Ottawa, Washington, and London. When people used to ask me where I lived, I said 6 miles from brake release on runway 32. And you could hear the VC-10 from the start of his takeoff run, and it was a very, very noisy aeroplane. These eventually were passed over to the Royal Air Force and used as troop transports and tankers, but the last one retired coming up to 5 years ago. Now Concorde, and I spent quite a bit of my life working on this, it was designed specifically for the range Paris-New York. And of course, with a supersonic aeroplane, you can't suddenly say, well, let's make the range 1,000 nautical miles more, or 2,000 nautical miles more. You finish up with a huge aeroplane, you get more power required, burn more fuel, and so on. But the Concorde finished up the maximum takeoff weight, 400,000 pounds. It carried 100 passengers in considerable comfort. It's often said, oh, Concorde was very small. And Concorde was quite small, but there was 4 very comfortable seats, and they were there for a bit over 3 hours, and it was very good. Cruise speed, 1,360 miles an hour, huge increase. 4 Olympus 593, 38,000 pounds with afterburning. Now, Concorde used afterburning on takeoff, and there was lots of silly criticism of how noisy this was. There were several occasions Concorde came to Ottawa and nobody knew it had been here. I was once going down to Halifax to see the boat people, and there was the Air France Concorde, which had brought the French president, and nobody knew that it was there. But anyway, the Concorde, it only carried 100 passengers. It was a pure first class plus aeroplane. And one of the interesting things about the afterburning on Concorde was that where normally a military engine, the afterburning temperature is about 2000 Kelvin, in Toronto on the Concorde, it was only 1440 Kelvin. So it was nowhere near the noise of a military engine with afterburning. This actually flight profile I took on a flight, believe it or not, 35 years ago. Seems incredible that we were flying at Mach 2 35 years ago, and it's now already 15 years since we stopped flying at Mach 2. But you can see here that the light again is very bad, but short taxi out, climb to 29,000 feet and hold for supersonic clearance, which took about half an hour to hear, and at that point, the 28,000 feet, they lit the afterburners, lit them in pairs, inboards and outboards, and climbed with afterburners up to Mach 1.73, turned off at 44,000 feet, and then climbed up to 60,000 feet, and then did a very rapid descent down into New York or London. And the flying time between, on this particular flight was 3 hours 38 minutes. And when we arrived, we were on our approach into Kennedy, the captain announced that the British Airways 747 that took off just in front of us was now nearly halfway across the Atlantic. Very satisfying feeling. And that's the basic, some of the information about Concorde. Cruise Mach number 2.04, true airspeed 1161 knots, 1337 miles an hour. But what's a very interesting that a lot of people never understood was that Concorde ran at 100% RPM on both shafts at all times except on descent. No other engine in the world has ever operated that way. If you look at something like a 777, probably at cruise, you might be around 92, maybe even 90% RPM, and that makes a huge difference in the stress levels, the temperature levels. And Concorde not only ran with both rotors, HP and LP, running at 100% RP, 100% all time. This was done at an intake temperature of up to 127 degrees centigrade. So the flight I did on this day, the temperature on the nose was only 108 degrees centigrade. And one of the interesting things about flying in Concorde was you could put your hand on the window and it was quite warm, unlike subsonic. Now, one of the interesting things about Concorde is Concorde was always sort of being attacked about how much fuel it burned. And it's rather interesting, in fact, if you look at the numbers, and these are actual numbers I got from BOAC. If you look at a 747-136, that was with Pratt engines, it burned 89,000 kilograms across the Atlantic, and Concorde burned 77,000. So actually Concorde burnt significantly less fuel than the early 747s, but of course, and in fact, if you back up there, you can see 75,000 kilograms there, and their planning number of 77,000. So the point was that Concorde actually burned less fuel than a 747, but of course it burned much more fuel per passenger. But on the other hand, if you're going to fly 2.5 times as fast, you'd certainly expect it to burn more. I mean, it's like the basic difference between driving your car at 60 miles an hour and 150 miles an hour. Certainly at 150 miles an hour, you'd expect to burn a bit more fuel. Now, I actually put together this catalogue of fuel burn per passenger, and these are definitely all estimates. Now, remember that the Constellation, I come up with a number of 520 pounds per hour, which I think was actually optimistic. I don't think the passenger number was high as that. So in fact, the early 707s their fuel burn per passenger was virtually double that of the subsonics. The 707-336 went to the fan engines, and that gave quite a big improvement in fuel burn per passenger. 747-100, big improvement because of the much larger number of passengers. 747-400, quite a bit more. A330, getting better, and the A380 and 777. And these actually are equivalent to something like about 92 passenger miles per gallon. And the 787 is probably a bit better than that. So that we're actually getting more and more efficient. In fact, I did a Guggenheim lecture a long time ago, and on the Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary, you were burning about 2,000 pounds of fuel per passenger to get across the Atlantic. You had about 4 tons of bodywork for every passenger. So the current situation now, of course, is with increasing engine reliability, the whole market has shifted to large twins, and the only large capacity aircraft is the A380, which has not been selling well, and the 747 fleet is shrinking very rapidly. So now there's very little flying across the Atlantic other than a few 747s and A380s. It's nearly all twins now. Now, this is one of the things that interesting is talking about safety, because nobody really thinks about danger if you're going to get on an aeroplane now. It just goes backwards and forwards. And in fact, that the unfortunate incident where the lady was killed in the Southwest aeroplane a couple of weeks ago, that was the first fatality on a major airline in North America in something like about 10 years. If you look at the Lockheed Constellation, the total built 856. Now, this was the one that was the prime one, 579. Hull losses on the L1049, about 20%. 20%. Look at the Stratocruiser, total built 55, hull losses 13, 25%. Now look at the modern airplane, the 777, total built, and that's quite a long time back, hull losses 5. And if you look at the hull losses on the 777, there was one crash landed coming into Heathrow because both engines shut down on the final approach, and it was finally tracked down to a problem with ice blockage in a filter on a heat exchanger. It had been a long flight from Beijing to London, very cold, a lot of ice formed at high altitude, and eventually it blocked off the fuel to the engines. And that is in fact really the only flight on the 777 that was in fact a technical problem. ANA at San Francisco was a pilot error on landing, clearly pilot error. Malaysian at Kuala Lumpur, nobody knows what happened to that aeroplane, but it's, in my opinion, highly likely that it was criminal activity, probably a planned suicide. Then there was the Malaysian Airlines that was shot down in the Ukraine. Emirates lost one with a failed go-around, which might have been pilot error, might have been systems failure. But there was no, basically that's 5 aeroplanes out of something like 1,400, probably near 1,600, compared to 579, 111 out of 579. It's an amazing difference. You look at that 13 out of 55, 5 out of probably 1,500, 1,600 now. And so say transatlantic crossings now, very cheap and reliable, extremely safe, and engine reliability and efficiency are the key to this success. Now, nobody's throwing anything yet. that I'd be glad to take some questions now, but I have another lecture that you might be interested in. I'll go through it very quickly. We're now in a situation where they're talking about starting to fly narrow-bodied aircraft across the Atlantic. And this has actually started with some 737s. And so we're talking now about 737s and A320s. Now, two things. I'll take any question you want just now, but if you want, I can talk a little bit more about what's going to happen in the next couple of years with this.
Yeah.
Yes?
So a couple of questions on the Concorde. One, the heavy weight of the Concorde for a small airplane, is that mostly because of fuel and engines? Or what accounted for the large difference in weight of the Concorde?
Well, basically, I'm not near an answer, but basically the real problem, if you look at the engine efficiency, the propulsive efficiency was actually considerably higher on the Concorde than it was on the 747. What gets you is the lift-drag ratio. Because the lift-drag ratio on modern aircraft like a 777 would be about 17, 18 to 1. On a Mark II aeroplane like Concorde, it's about 7. So you've got a heck of a lot more thrust because of the higher speed, so your fuel consumption is much higher.
So the fuel is what's accounting for most of the weight of the aircraft?
Yeah,
the
probably.
400,000?
Yeah.
That was a substantially larger number,
Yeah, yeah. But I say that that was the point. Is that's why it's so difficult to get a very long range. If you look at the aircraft like the A330, it started off as a sort of kind of medium range aeroplane, and now its range is up way over 6,000 nautical miles. And you can do that with a subsonic aircraft, but you can't with a supersonic aircraft.
I have an observation. Between 1985 and 2005, I was probably at the Public Record Office in Kew about 10 times. And Kew is right on the flight path in and out of Heathrow.
Right.
And in my goings back and forth at that Kew, I came to conclude that there were three types of airplanes in the world: the 747, the Concorde, and everything else.
Well, it's interesting that I go back to this living 6 miles from brake release on runway 32. By a long way, the noisiest aeroplane that ever operated in that, other than the VC-10, which only came twice a month, was the Boeing 727. And the 727, passing over my house at Carlingwood, practically shook the house to its foundations. And it was just incredibly noisy. And that day, I was once at San Francisco on some meeting, and I dropped into the noise office there and said, "What's your biggest noise problem here?" And said, 727. And the Trident was also very noisy. But
I just remember the Concorde is the noisiest thing I ever saw in the air.
you probably never saw a VC-10.
Probably did not, no.
In
What
fact,
about
the
an
VC,
SR-71?
Yeah.
That's pretty noisy.
well, the VC-10, in fact, that on the Conway engine, they had a problem with, they couldn't get the maximum thrust until the seals, internal seals, all closed up. And they found, in fact, that it took 2 minutes from the engine accelerating to maximum speed for the seals to close up and all the thrust to get there. And of course, you couldn't stand at the end of the runway at Heathrow for 2 minutes, the VC-10 at full power. And they actually had to derate the engine by 2,000 pounds thrust. So that when they got up to maximum RPM, they were 2,000 pounds short out of 20 until the seals closed up, but they couldn't stand there making all that noise and they had to go. Yes?
Foreign object damage is pretty serial with the Concorde. Did they do anything to prevent that in terms of designing the engine intake?
Say again, I missed the first part.
Foreign object damage on the Concorde?
Not really, but the Concorde was actually, I beg your pardon, that Don asked me to repeat any questions because very often the audience couldn't hear them. The question of the gentleman was, did they make any particular steps to protect the Concorde from foreign object damage? And the answer is basically no, but it was a very rugged engine. In fact, they did, in fact, at one stage actually swallow one of the the ramps, the variable geometry ramps, came off and stuck in the front and didn't do any major damage. So the 593 was, in fact, a very rugged engine. Now, eventually, of course, that they had the big disaster in Paris where the airplane came down. The variable geometry intake was, in fact, a major requirement on Concorde because it was changing shape at all times as the Mach number changed. And as a matter of fact, it might be interesting from the historical point of view that the work that we started at Orenda on the Iroquois, simulating engine performance, I took on at Bristol and used that on the design of the Concorde engine, and eventually the original intake system, control system in Concorde was an analog system designed by Ultra Electronics. When the British Aerospace Guided Weapons Group found out what I was doing, they hired me as a consultant, and I used my mathematical model of the Olympus to design a digital control system for a Concorde, and that's what was used. So in fact, there's a direct link from the work that was done on the Iroquois Arrow program to Concorde that nobody's ever said much about.
Thank you.
You have a question?